I've said that this is a lecture that Stephen gives. I don't want you to have the idea, though, that he's giving this to a packed room. It's not that at all. It's at most 4 or 5 people, and they hardly even seem to be listening at some points. One of them will leave, and Buck Mulligan will arrive late. It's more like a Socratic dialogue, or one of Oscar Wilde's dialogues, which it will be compared to. But it does give Stephen an opportunity to explain his idea, and it is much more elaborate than Bloom's idea that Hamlet was a woman. After so much moving around in the previous episodes, you may be relieved to find that this episode is a pretty stable setting. It's just in the library, some cozy little nook. I imagine it as maybe a private little room. We can imagine that Joyce himself spent many hours reading in this library. Let's talk about the characters in this episode. There's Stephen, of course, giving the lecture. Buck Mulligan is there, but he will arrive late. He will not be there for the whole thing. Remember that Stephen in the morning was supposed to meet Mulligan at this pub, the Ship, but instead of going to the Ship, he went with the other men in Aeolus to the other pub, Murphy's. So instead of meeting Mulligan, he sends a telegram to him, and we'll read that telegram in a bit. But Mulligan is better than Haynes, who doesn't even show up at all. He's off at a bookstore looking for some book in the Irish literary revival type of thing, a book of songs. Also present is that poet, A.E. George Russell, who we've mentioned before. So if that was George Russell that we saw on the bicycle that Bloom spotted an episode or two back, that was probably him heading to the library. He will not stay for all of Stephen's lecture, although he will make a few comments, but he has to get going. He has another appointment, and he has to skedaddle. Thomas William Leister is a librarian. He is the Quaker librarian referred to in the very first sentence of this episode. He's done a little writing and editing, I think some book on Goethe, so that connects to the reference to Goethe that we get pretty early on. John Eglinton is another writer and librarian. I think his real name was William K. McGee, but he wrote under the name John Eglinton. Richard Best is a assistant director at the National Library, and I guess after Ulysses was published, because these are all real people, he was not at all happy with the way he was characterized by Joyce in the book, but hey, get in line. As you continue to look for Stephen Bloom parallels, there's one more I think you'll see in this episode, is that among these literary dudes, Stephen is sort of a literary outsider. They don't totally respect him, and you'll see that, remember, Bloom, because of his Jewishness, is not totally accepted and respected by his peers. Now, among the books that I think that Ulysses most resembles, I would have to say the number one is the Bible, because each of these episodes you can think of somewhat like a book of the Bible, in that they're each has a different style, each is somewhat self-contained but also connected to the others, and each paints a larger picture. I think you see that. But among authors, I would say Shakespeare, in terms of the sheer scope of Joyce's goals and his characters and just all the humanity and amazing ideas that he includes, I would say Shakespeare. But because this is a novel, how do we show that? How do we see that? Well, I think it has to do with the way that Joyce transforms the text in this episode, but also later on in Circe, into this play-like structure at moments. He'll turn it into like a play. And if you've read Joyce's earlier play, Exiles, I do not care for that play very much, and I think it's a play that looks backward towards, Ibsen and things that Joyce was really into, but that type of writing is not what we see in Ulysses. Just as Dubliners is not really Joyce looking into new forms, it's him looking backwards. But with Ulysses, because it's expanding into new territory, the play-like structure is going to be completely different and really fantastic, and it's going to do things. It's really a closet drama. You couldn't perform these things in a real theater. I mean, some people have attempted it, and there have been movie versions too, but it's really, the elements are just so eccentric and fantastic, and you couldn't possibly film him. It defies physics. So I think this is Joyce really just exploding the possibilities of narrative. You may have heard this saying that Joyce once asked his friend, I forget who, that who is the most complete character in fiction? And they were naming different people like Hamlet and so on. But Joyce finally said, no, it's Odysseus, because he had all these different ways of being perceived. He was a soldier, he was a son, he was a father, he was a husband. So he was a very complete character. But I was thinking about the way that we think about Shakespeare and the way that Joyce delineates Shakespeare in this episode. He's a very complete character too, if you consider him a fiction, because there is so much about Shakespeare that we don't know. We have only the barest frame of his life. So everybody that writes about him is really, they're acting as an author, they're characterizing him. And I think in that sense, he is a pretty remarkable character based on what because we get to see really deeply into his mind with his plays and his poems, but we know very little about his actual life. Just these very few moments here and there. And I think of it also connecting to other historical figures like Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, who we have only the barest outline of their own lives, and we have to speculate also a lot. But we do have their ideas, and their ideas are what live on in us. Let's talk a minute about Shakespeare. He's somewhat of an Odysseus-like figure in some ways. As we'll see, we have some information. We know approximately when he was born, approximately when he died. Here it is. And we know that he got married pretty young when he was about 18, and his wife was 26, Anne Hathaway. He had 3 children. One of his children, his only son, Hamnet, which sounds very similar to Hamlet, he died when he was just 11. And also that Shakespeare went to London. He also has this gap of about, I think, like 5 or 6 years where we don't know anything about what happened with him. And then he arrives in London. He's like this up-and-coming playwright, and he wrote for quite a number of years in London. And then later in his life, he returns back to Stratford-on-Avon and was a pretty successful businessman. And then he dies. So we have this outline. I've read a few books on Shakespeare that I can recommend. One is Peter Ackroyd's book, I forget the title, Shakespeare, a biography, I think. And any biography of Shakespeare, a lot of speculation. But this book is really a lot about the era and what we can infer based on what we know about the historical epoch. Another good book for the generalist is Bill Bryson's, I think it's called Shakespeare, I forget. But both of those I would recommend. Very good intros to Shakespeare if you don't know too much. But also just having a broad familiarity with his plays will help you enormously in this episode. There are going to be so many references to Shakespeare plays. Joyce references just about every play if he can. I mean, there's some minor plays that he doesn't mention, but every major play you're going to get some quotation or paraphrase included.